The letter arrived before Eleanor Ashford had finished her first cup of tea. She was sitting at the kitchen table in Ashfield House, watching the rain run down the window glass in long silver lines, when she heard the post slot open and something heavy drop onto the floor. She did not move immediately. The post rarely brought anything worth moving for. Bills, mostly. The occasional circular from a merchant in town. Once, memorably, a wedding invitation from a cousin she had not seen in 11 years. But something made her set down her cup. Her father, George Ashford, was already in the hallway. She heard him pick up the envelope. She heard him stop walking. That was what made her stand up. The stopping. George Ashford had not stopped in the middle of a hallway in the 24 years Eleanor had been alive. He was a man of deliberate, continuous movement. He walked from room to room with purpose, even when the purpose was small. Stopping meant something had stopped him. She found him standing 3 feet from the front door, holding the envelope at his side with both hands, the way a man holds something he has not yet decided whether to open. His face had gone a color she had never seen on it before, not the pale of illness or the red of anger, something between, something that had no comfortable name, the color of a man who has just understood something he did not want to understand. Eleanor took the envelope from his hands. He did not resist. She opened it at the kitchen table with the lamp pulled close and read it twice, once for the words and once for the meaning, because letters like this always put the meaning somewhere slightly behind the words. The Mercer Banking House of London. A debt of £4,200 accumulated over the course of 7 years against the collateral of the Ashfield estate. The interest alone for the previous 12 months came to £340. The letter was polite, precise, and completely without softness. Payment in full was required within 60 days of the letter's date. In the event of non-payment, the Mercer Banking House would exercise its legal right to seize and liquidate the property known as Ashfield, including all land, buildings, livestock, and contents therein. £4,200. Eleanor set the letter flat on the table and pressed her palms against it, as if pressure could change what was written there. She had known the estate was in difficulty. She had known it for 3 years, since the summer her father sat her down in this same kitchen and showed her the account books with the expression of a man confessing something he had kept far too long. She had taken over the accounts that same evening. She had managed them since then with the grim, focused precision of someone who has accepted a problem that has no clean solution, only the continuous work of keeping it from becoming worse. She had kept it from becoming worse. She had thought that was enough. It was not enough. Apparently it had never been enough. Somewhere underneath the numbers she had been carefully managing, the foundations had been crumbling at a depth she had not reached. £4,200. Her father sat down across from her. He looked like a man who had set down a weight he had been carrying secretly for years and was now too tired to explain how long it had been there. He did not speak. Eleanor did not speak either, for a long time. The rain continued down the window. The lamp burned steadily. She said finally that they would need to think. He nodded. She said she would go through the full accounts that afternoon, every document, every record, every figure. He nodded again. She folded the letter back into the envelope and put it inside the kitchen drawer, under the household receipts, because there was no use in it sitting on the table being looked at. Then she refilled her tea, sat down with the account books and began. 3 hours later she had the full picture. She had been managing the household expenses with considerable care. The income from the tenant farms, reduced over the previous 2 seasons by poor weather and one genuinely disastrous harvest, was running at about 60% of what it had been 5 years earlier. There were outstanding debts to 3 local suppliers that she had been managing in rotation, paying each one just enough to prevent them from calling in the full amount. There was the matter of the east roof, which had needed replacing for 4 years, and had instead been patched twice with money they did not have to spare. The silver her mother had left, most of it sold already. The last 4 pieces set aside, because selling them felt like removing the final marker that something had once been better. The total available in accessible funds, £260. Against 4,200. Eleanor closed the account books and sat for a long time looking at the kitchen wall. She was 24 years old. She had spent the better part of the previous 3 years doing the invisible, exhausting work of keeping a struggling household from the edge of disaster, and she had done it well enough that no one from the outside would have known there was anything wrong. Ashfield still looked respectable from the road. The garden was kept, the windows were clean. She had managed appearances with the same thoroughness she had managed the accounts, because in her world, appearance was a form of credit, and credit was the only thing between them and a conversation exactly like the one she was now having. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury she had never been able to afford. She picked up a pen and a clean sheet of paper and wrote down the words, "What can be done?" She underlined them. Then she stared at the blank space below for 10 minutes before she wrote a single thing, because the honest answer was, not very much. Not from here, not with what they had. That evening her father came to the kitchen doorway and stood there long enough that she looked up from the papers. He said he was sorry. He said he had thought, for a long time, that the situation would improve before it became what it had become. He said he had believed, in the particular stubborn way that proud men sometimes believe things that are not true, that the farms would recover and the income would return and the loan would be manageable without ever having to explain to anyone how large it had grown. Eleanor looked at him for a moment. She said she knew. She said it without anger. There was no useful anger here. There was only the situation and what could be done about it. She told him she was thinking about going to London. He asked what was in London. She said she did not know yet. But the letter had come from London, and London was where people with money were, and where people with problems sometimes found, if they looked carefully, and without too much pride, that someone with money had a use for someone with a problem. She had no clear idea yet what that meant in her specific case. She only knew that Wiltshire had nothing left to offer her, and 60 days was not a long time, and she had never in her life solved a problem by staying exactly where she was and waiting for it to resolve itself. Her father said nothing for a moment. Then he said she should be careful. She said she was always careful. She was at her desk until well past midnight, writing letters, reviewing documents, and making a list of every person she knew who had any connection to London and any reason to help her. The list was short, but it was not empty. The second letter arrived the following Thursday. Eleanor had gone to the village to pay the butcher's account, a small and nearly symbolic amount that she paid weekly to maintain the relationship and the credit that came with it. When she returned to Ashfield, the second letter was on the hall table, same weight of paper as the first, but not the same seal. The seal on this one was a crest she did not recognize. The handwriting was professional, precise, and quite different from the bureaucratic clarity of the Mercer banking house. This was the hand of someone who wrote a great many important letters and had refined the process to an efficiency that was almost a form of elegance. It was addressed to her father. She opened it anyway, because there was no longer any point in observing formalities about correspondence when the house itself might not exist in 60 days. The letter was from a firm of solicitors on Lincoln's Inn Fields in London. It stated that their client, who they described only as a gentleman of considerable means and position, had become aware of the Ashfield estate's financial obligations and wished to propose a meeting. The firm was not at liberty to disclose their client's identity in advance of the meeting. However, they were authorized to state that their client's intentions were, in the most direct possible sense, favorable to the continued ownership of Ashfield by the Ashford family. They requested a meeting at offices in London at Eleanor's earliest convenience. Eleanor read the letter through 3 times. She put it in the kitchen drawer alongside the first letter. Then she went upstairs to begin packing a bag. She told her father at dinner that she was going to London in the morning. She told him about the letter. She said she did not know who the client was or what they wanted. She said it was possible this was nothing. She said it was equally possible it was the only thing that might help them. George Ashford sat with that information for a long moment. He was a man who had, in better years, prided himself on handling his own affairs. He was a man who had watched himself handle them less and less well over the years, and who had, bit by bit, handed more and more of them to his daughter, and who was now being told that his daughter was going to London alone to meet an unknown man about the debt that had built up while he was not handling his affairs. He said he would come with her. Eleanor said she would rather go alone. He looked at her. She said that whoever this person was, they had written to arrange a meeting, which meant they wanted something. And people who wanted something were people you could negotiate with. And she could negotiate better without her father in the room, because her father's face, when it came to the finances of Ashfield, told the whole story in the first 2 minutes. George Ashford was quiet for a moment. Then he said she was probably right. She was on the morning coach to London before the rain had fully decided whether it was going to commit to the day. The coach reached London in the late afternoon. Eleanor had made this journey twice before, once as a child and once 4 years ago for a cousin's wedding, and both times she had found the city excessive, too large, too loud, too indifferent to the specific weight of any individual life within it. She found it no less excessive now, but today excessive felt, if not welcome, at least useful. A city this large did not see you, unless you made it see you. It was not watching for her mistakes. The solicitor's offices were on a narrow, quiet street that communicated seriousness through understatement. The building was dark brick and tall windows and brass fittings on the door. Inside, it smelled of paper and beeswax and the particular stillness of rooms where decisions are regularly made about large sums of money. A clerk with a careful, practiced manner took her name and showed her to a waiting room on the first floor. The waiting room had 2 chairs, a side table with nothing on it, and a painting of a landscape that had been chosen, very clearly, for its complete inoffensiveness. She sat in one of the chairs and placed her hands in her lap and waited. She had been waiting for perhaps 8 minutes when the door opened. The man who walked through it was not what she had expected. She had formed no precise mental image, but somewhere in the back of her mind she had been expecting older, perhaps 60, perhaps a large man with the settled, broad-shouldered confidence of someone who had been powerful for a long time, or alternatively a thin, precise, paper-colored man whose power lived entirely in documents and signatures. What she got was neither. He was perhaps 31 or 32. He was tall, well-built in a way that was not decorative, with a face that was quite striking, and also quite deliberately expressionless, not unfriendly, controlled. He wore his clothes with the ease of someone who has never had to think about what to wear, because the clothes have always simply been correct. He came into the room without any of the social fussing that men of position often use to establish that they have position. He said his name, William Cavendish, Duke of Hartwell. Eleanor did not move. She kept her expression exactly where it was, which required more effort than she would have liked to admit. The solicitor, who had materialized somewhere behind the Duke, retreated from the room with the practiced invisibility of a man who has learned that his most useful role in certain conversations is the one he plays after he has left. They sat down. The Duke looked at her for a moment before he spoke, not rudely, assessingly. She had the impression of someone who made decisions carefully, and had already begun making this one. He said that he was aware of the Ashfield Estates situation with the Mercer banking house. He said this matter-of-factly, without apology, because it was a fact, and there was no useful purpose served by apologizing for knowing facts. He said he wished to propose an arrangement. He said he needed a wife. Eleanor kept her hand still in her lap and her face where it was, and waited for him to continue. He explained with the directness of a man who finds directness more efficient than any alternative. His position in the House of Lords was under pressure from a political alliance that had formed against his interests. There were procedural conventions that affected the weight of his position in certain votes, conventions tied to domestic and social standing. He had been a widower for 2 years. He had, in those 2 years, withdrawn from London society almost entirely. This had been, from a personal standpoint, what he required. From a political standpoint, it had created vulnerabilities he could no longer afford. He needed to re-enter society with a wife beside him, someone capable of managing a large London household and a country estate, someone with enough intelligence and composure to function in the political and social world his position required, someone who would give him, under all circumstances, no reason for scandal. In exchange, the Ashfield debt would be cleared, the estate would be secured, there would be a personal allowance, there would be nothing required of her that he had not just described. He paused. Then he said, in exactly the same tone as everything else he had said, that she was under no obligation to care for him. He said it as a contractual point. One term among several. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at this man, this Duke, this stranger with his controlled face and his unsentimental offer and his perfectly reasonable proposal for a transaction that would shape the remainder of both their lives. She thought about Ashfield, about her father in the hallway holding the envelope, about the kitchen drawer with 2 letters in it, and the account books with their honest, terrible numbers. She said yes. The Duke looked at her. Something moved very briefly across his face, some small recalibration, and then it was controlled again. She said she agreed to his terms. He said the solicitor would begin drafting the necessary documents, and that he would arrange for the simplest possible ceremony, as he had no interest in a public occasion. She said that suited her perfectly. He stood and extended his hand. She shook it. It was a firm, brief handshake, the handshake of 2 people concluding a transaction. Eleanor walked out of the building and onto the street and stood on the pavement in the pale London afternoon. The street was busy around her, indifferent, moving at its own pace. She stood absolutely still in the middle of it for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she flagged down a cab, because she had a great deal to arrange, and standing on pavements was not one of the things that would help her arrange any of it. The wedding took place 12 days later, in a chapel near the Strand that was small enough that the word intimate would have been flattering. 7 people were present. Eleanor, the Duke, her father, 2 of the Duke's solicitors, a witness whose name Eleanor forgot immediately, and a minister who performed the ceremony with the brisk professionalism of a man who has conducted a great many weddings and has learned to calibrate his warmth to the occasion. The ceremony lasted 23 minutes. Eleanor wore her best dress, which was a dark blue wool she had bought 3 years ago for a function she now could not recall, and which had been let out once at the waist and was perfectly respectable. She carried no flowers. There was no music. The Duke wore a dark coat and said his words clearly and without hesitation, which was, she thought, exactly what she would have expected of him. Afterward, they signed the documents at a table in the vestry. The solicitors witnessed. Her father stood to one side with the expression of a man who is not entirely sure whether what he is feeling is relief or something more complicated, and who has decided that the question can wait until he is home. The notice of the marriage would run in the London Gazette 3 days later. Eleanor became, in the vestry of a chapel near the Strand on a grey November morning, Eleanor Cavendish, Duchess of Hartwell. The words felt strange in her mouth when she tested them privately on the cab ride to Hartwell House, which was on the other side of the city from everything she had known and was, she was about to discover, considerably larger than she had prepared herself for. Hartwell House occupied a corner position on one of Mayfair's quieter streets and announced itself with the understatement of a building that has nothing to prove. 4 stories of stone that had weathered to a soft, particular gray, tall windows, a black iron fence, and a front door that opened, as she arrived, before she had reached the steps. The butler, a man named Holt with the composure of a cathedral, greeted her with precisely the right measure of formal welcome. Behind him, in the entrance hall, a line of staff waited to be introduced. Eleanor had managed a household of 4 people at Ashfield, including herself and her father. The staff of Hartwell House in London numbered 22. She walked the line and looked each person in the eye and said something to each of them, something specific if she could manage it, something genuine if not. By the end of the line she had learned 6 names and forgotten 4, but she had seen enough faces to know what she was working with, which was a household of people who had been managing themselves during 2 years of their employer's withdrawal, and who were very carefully watching to determine what the new arrangement would mean for them. She recognized this kind of watching. She had been watched this way by creditors. The calculation behind it was the same. This person is new. What do they want? Will they be a problem? She could work with that. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Alderton, was somewhere in her 50s, with the contained, professional manner of someone who has held a position of authority for a long time and held it well. She showed Eleanor through the principal rooms of the house with a thoroughness that managed to be both helpful and slightly testing. Every room was immaculate. Every surface was perfectly arranged. The house had been kept, during the 2 years of the Duke's relative absence from society, with the meticulous care of people who take pride in their work regardless of whether anyone is watching. Eleanor made a point of saying so. She told Mrs. Alderton, plainly and without performance, that the house was in exceptional order and that she could see the work it had taken to maintain it. Mrs. Alderton's expression did not change precisely, but something in it shifted. Some small recalibration of judgment. Eleanor filed this away and moved on. The Duke did not appear at dinner that first evening. She had not expected him to. They had agreed, in the solicitor's office, on certain practical arrangements, and being in each other's company constantly had not been among them. He had returned to his own affairs and she had returned to hers, and hers now were these rooms, this household, this new and extraordinary life that she was going to have to learn very quickly. She ate alone in the large dining room, which seated 30, and considered the situation. She was the Duchess of Hartwell. She was the wife of a man she had met once before today, in a solicitor's office, for a conversation that had lasted less than an hour. She was in a house in London that she had never been inside before this afternoon. She had a title that half of England would consider significant, and a marriage that no one who knew either of them would have predicted. She was also, for the first time in 3 years, not counting money, not calculating which supplier to pay and which to defer, not watching the income figures with the slightly sick concentration of a person trying to keep a glass too full from spilling, not waking in the small hours to run through numbers in her head and reach the same unhelpful conclusion she had reached the night before. Ashfield was saved. Her father was safe. That was what she had agreed to this for, and that was what she had received. She ate her dinner. She went to bed in a room that was 3 times the size of her room at Ashfield, and had a fire that had been lit in advance and sheets that were softer than anything she had slept on in her adult life. She lay on her back in the dark and looked at the ceiling, and thought with the methodical practicality that had gotten her this far about what she would need to do next. She would need to learn this house. She would need to learn its rhythms and its staff and its particular way of doing things. She would need to understand the social world she was about to enter, its rules and its hierarchies and its specific unspoken languages. She would need to be, convincingly and consistently, the Duchess of Hartwell, which was not a role she had been preparing for, but was one she was going to perform, without giving anyone the opportunity to see that she was performing it. She had done harder things. She fell asleep. The first weeks in London were a process of education conducted entirely in public. There was no preparation period. There was no quiet interval in which to learn the landscape before she was expected to navigate it. London society had heard about the marriage. The notice in the Gazette had been brief, but brief notices are sometimes the loudest kind, because brevity, in certain circles, signals a significance that has decided it requires no announcement. William Cavendish, Duke of Hartwell, to Miss Eleanor Ashford of Ashfield, Wiltshire. 3 lines. No description of the ceremony, no mention of the date, no notice of celebration. The drawing rooms of London, which had been watching the Duke's reclusive behavior for 2 years, with the patient interest of people waiting for something to happen, received this information like a tide receiving a stone. The ripples went out immediately. Eleanor became aware of the ripples through a series of calls in the first week, visits from ladies whose names she had researched in advance using every resource available to her, which were limited but not nothing. She had asked Mrs. Alderton for the household's records of previous social calls, which turned out to be extensive and well organized, and she had spent 2 evenings going through them before the first callers arrived. She received each one in the drawing room. She was warm without being eager. She was interested without being inquisitive. She asked the questions that led people to talk about the things they wanted to talk about, which in almost every case were themselves, their families, their opinions, and the information they had gathered. And she listened with the quality of attention that makes people feel genuinely heard, which is both rarer and more powerful than most people realize. She also watched. She watched what was said and, more usefully, what was not said. She watched the directions in which conversations were carefully steered and the directions from which they were steered away. She watched the small physical signals, the slight pause before a particular name, the fractional shift of expression at a certain topic, that told her where the actual information in a social exchange was located. She had learned to read people at Ashfield, where managing relationships with suppliers and creditors and tenant farmers had required a continuous, attentive reading of human motivation. The vocabulary was different in London. The accents and the clothes and the social stakes were different. The underlying human machinery was not. The Duke appeared at dinner on her 4th evening in Hartwell House. He did not announce this in advance. She came down at the usual time and found the table set for 2 and the Duke already in his chair. He stood when she entered, which was correct, and asked if she had settled in, which was also correct, and she said she had, which was true enough for a dinner conversation. They ate through the first course in a silence that was not quite comfortable but was not hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who are strangers and have not yet found the register in which they can speak naturally. She asked him, over the second course, whether there was anything particular she should know before the Ashworth dinner at the end of the month, which Mrs. Alderton had told her was one of the major early events of the season, and one at which the Duke's presence was expected. He looked at her for a moment before answering, as though the question had surprised him. Then he told her about the Ashworths. He told her who would be there, and what their various connections were to him and to each other. He told her where the particular sensitivities in the room would be and why. He spoke for perhaps 12 minutes without pausing, covering the political and social landscape of a single dinner party with the thorough, organized intelligence of a man who thinks about these things seriously. Eleanor listened. She asked 2 questions. He answered them both with the same precision. When he finished, he looked at her again in that brief, assessing way. She said it was helpful. She said she would be ready. He said he expected she would. It was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was the beginning, possibly, of something that might one day become a functional mutual respect, which was, she reminded herself, exactly what had been negotiated. Nothing more had been promised, and nothing more should be expected. She reminded herself of this several times over the following weeks, because the Duke turned out, at dinner and in the carriage on the way to events and in the few minutes of conversation that accumulated here and there across the days, to be considerably more interesting than she had allowed herself to anticipate. He was precise but not rigid. He was controlled but not cold. He had opinions that were genuinely his own, and not simply the received positions of his class, and he expressed them with a directness that she found, after years of managing conversations in which the real content was always located somewhere other than the words, extremely refreshing. He read seriously. He thought about what he read. When she said something he disagreed with, he said so, which she preferred to the alternative. She reminded herself about the arrangement. She reminded herself about the arrangement quite regularly. The Gazette notice ran on a Thursday. By Friday noon, Charles Whitmore had read it. He was at breakfast in his townhouse in Kensington. a house that his wife's family had provided as part of the settlement of their marriage 3 years earlier, when his wife Cecily came into the dining room with the newspaper and set it beside his coffee without saying anything. He looked at it. He looked at her. She had an expression he recognized as the one she wore when she had information she was not sure how to deliver. He picked up the Gazette. He found the notice on the 3rd page, which was where such notices ran. 3 lines. He read them once. He set the paper down. Cecily said, carefully, that she had not known the Ashford girl had connections in that direction. Charles said nothing. Cecily said it was quite a thing. Charles picked up his coffee and drank it. It was still hot. He set it down again and looked at the window. The Ashford girl, Eleanor Ashford, who had stood in the parlor at the family estate 3.5 years ago, and listened to him explain, with what he had considered at the time considerable grace, that the direction of his life and the direction of their friendship were going to be different from what they had perhaps both anticipated. Eleanor Ashford, who had listened to all of it without crying and without any of the scenes he had prepared himself for, and who had then simply been very quiet for a moment and said she understood. Eleanor Ashford, who had been living very quietly in Wiltshire ever since, managing her father's diminishing estate, not going anywhere in particular, not doing anything that came to his attention. Except that now she was the Duchess of Hartwell. William Cavendish had a seat in the Lords that 3 separate political factions had been trying to influence for the past 18 months. He had land in 4 counties. He had a house in London and an estate in the country, and a set of financial interests that touched a significant portion of the things that mattered in England at the moment. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most significant men in the country, and Eleanor Ashford was his wife. Charles Whitmore looked at the window for a long moment. Then he looked back at his wife, who was watching him with the careful eyes she used when she was deciding something. He said it was certainly something, yes. He said no more. He finished his breakfast. He went to his study and sat at his desk and did not do the work he had planned to do that morning, because he was thinking about something else entirely, which was the expression on Eleanor Ashford's face the day he had sat in the Ashfield parlor and explained his decision to her. He had told himself, afterward, that she had been fine, that she had understood and had been fine, and that it had been the right thing for both of them, and that she was getting along perfectly well in Wiltshire. He sat at his desk and looked at the closed door of his study and thought about the expression on her face, which he had not, he was beginning to realize, remembered accurately. Eleanor attended her first significant event of the London season 6 days after the Gazette notice ran, which was 5 days after every person who mattered in London society had read it and formed an initial opinion, and which meant that she walked into the Ashworth dinner, already the subject of a great deal of considered speculation. She was aware of this. She had by this point become quite good at being aware of things that were happening around her without appearing to be aware of them, which was a skill she had developed at Ashfield in the course of managing situations that required her to know more than she was supposed to know. The same skill worked here, simply at larger scale and higher stakes. She wore a gown in deep green silk, borrowed. She had been honest with Mrs. Alderton about the state of her personal wardrobe on her 3rd morning in London, because honesty had seemed more efficient than the alternative, and Mrs. Alderton had handled it with the flat practicality of a woman who has dealt with worse surprises, and arranged, through some mechanism Eleanor did not inquire into, for several suitable things to be available in time for the first occasions. The green silk was one of them. It fitted almost perfectly, and the color was right. The Duke, who was waiting in the entrance hall when she came downstairs, looked at her for a moment and said she looked well. She said thank you. They were in the carriage for 20 minutes. He told her the names of 3 people she would definitely encounter and 2 things about each. She asked one question about the host's political alignment, and he answered it in 2 sentences. Then the carriage stopped. The Ashworth house was lit from every window. The street in front of it held 6 other carriages in various stages of arrival, and there were footmen and lamplight, and the particular organized chaos of a large London dinner party in full preparation. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage and looked at it all for exactly 2 seconds. Then she put her hand on the Duke's arm and they walked in. What happened over the following 3 hours was, from the outside, an entirely ordinary dinner party. From the inside, it was something considerably more complex. Eleanor had arrived knowing she was being assessed. She had arrived prepared for this, because she had been preparing for it since the vestry of the chapel near the Strand. She had thought carefully, in the days leading to this evening, about what the assessment would involve, and what a successful response to it would look like. It would not look like performance. Performance was visible. The people in this room had spent their entire lives in rooms exactly like this one, and they knew, with the instinctive precision of long practice, when someone was performing rather than being. Performance had a slightly elevated quality to it, a fractional excess of correctness, a micro degree of effort, that the trained observer caught immediately and filed under uncertain. What she needed to do was simply be present, be genuinely herself, which was someone who was interested in people, who listened carefully, who had opinions, who knew how to be interested in what other people cared about without pretending to care about things she didn't. She needed to be this person consistently, without the slight pulling together that performance requires, for 3 hours among strangers who were watching her. She found, to her own mild surprise, that this was not as difficult as she had feared. She sat at dinner next to a man named Lord Pemberton, who was in his 50s and had the slightly weary intelligence of someone who has been in political rooms for 30 years and has learned to find them interesting by finding the people in them interesting. He spoke about a bill currently before the Lords with the informed exasperation of someone who cares about the outcome more than the process. Eleanor asked 3 questions. They were the right 3 questions, not because she had planned them, but because she was genuinely curious about what he was saying, and genuine curiosity produces better questions than strategic positioning almost every time. Lord Pemberton looked at her after the 3rd question with a slight recalibration of expression. He said she had a good grasp of the situation. She said she had been reading about it. He said most people who said that had not been. She said she supposed she was different from most people then. He laughed. It was a short laugh, but a real one. Across the table, she was aware of the Duke noting the exchange. She was not looking at him, but she had developed a certain peripheral awareness of him in social situations, the way you develop an awareness of weather in a place where weather matters. After dinner, when the party moved to the drawing rooms, she had a conversation with 2 women, whose names she had learned from Mrs. Alderton's call records. Lady Pemberton, who was married to the man she had just spoken to at dinner, and was considerably sharper than her pleasant, conventional surface suggested, and a woman named Mrs. Hartley, who was not titled but whose position in London society rested on 30 years of knowing everyone worth knowing, and remembering every relevant thing about all of them. Eleanor had been particularly careful in her preparation for these 2. She did not try to impress them. Impressing people like Lady Pemberton and Mrs. Hartley was not the point, and was not, in any case, possible through direct effort. What was possible was being genuine enough, and interesting enough, and not obviously foolish enough, that they would leave the evening with a slightly better impression than they had arrived with. She asked Lady Pemberton about a letter she had apparently written 2 years ago about the conditions in the charity schools south of the river, a letter that Eleanor had happened to read in the records of a committee her father had once been involved with. Lady Pemberton had clearly not expected anyone to have read this letter. She had clearly also not expected anyone to have a question about its 3rd paragraph that was substantive enough to require a considered answer. She answered it. They talked for 12 minutes. Mrs. Hartley, watching, said nothing for those 12 minutes and then said a great deal afterward, in the carriage home, to Lady Pemberton, none of which Eleanor heard, but all of which, she learned later, was broadly positive. She did not know this yet. She knew only that the evening had gone as well as she had hoped, possibly slightly better, and that the Duke, in the carriage on the way home, said that Lord Pemberton had told him she was a remarkable woman. Eleanor said Lord Pemberton was kind. The Duke said Lord Pemberton was not, generally speaking, kind, and that this was not what he had meant. Eleanor looked out the carriage window at the London streets moving past in the dark and said nothing, but something shifted slightly in her chest, some small, careful thing, which she noted, and then set aside because there was no useful purpose in examining it too closely. The weeks that followed were, socially speaking, a campaign. Eleanor conducted it with the same methodical thoroughness she had brought to the accounts at Ashfield, which was to say with complete attention to detail, clear priorities, and no sentimentality about the work. The social world she was navigating had its own logic, its own power structures, its own particular currencies, and she learned them the way she had learned everything that had ever mattered, by paying close attention and asking the right questions of the right people, and taking nothing for granted. She was not always correct. There were evenings that did not go as well as she had hoped, conversations that did not take the direction she had intended, judgments she made that required revision. She noted these and adjusted. This was not very different from managing suppliers. The Duke was, she discovered, a man whose professional life was conducted with extreme intelligence, and whose personal life had, for 2 years, been conducted with something approaching willful neglect. He understood the political world around him with a clarity she found genuinely impressive. He did not understand, or had not until recently been willing to engage with, the social world that sustained it. These were not, in Eleanor's view, separable things. She said as much to him one evening when they were going through the guest list for a dinner she was planning at Hartwell House. He looked at her for a moment. He said she might have a point. She said she had several, and she handed him the list with her notes on it, which included specific observations about the political positioning of 7 of the 12 guests, and 2 recommendations about the seating that she thought he would find obvious once he read them. He read them. He looked up. He said the seating was exactly right. She said she was glad he could see that. He looked at her again in that brief, direct way that she had begun to understand was not assessment so much as attention, not evaluation so much as the way he looked at things that were genuinely interesting to him. She put the list back in order and they moved on to the next item. The dinner at Hartwell House was, by the standards of the season, a considerable success. 30 people, the right 30. In a dining room Eleanor had spent 2 days reordering on paper before she committed to any actual change. The food was not extravagant, but it was very good. Because Mrs. Alderton knew her work and had been given, for the first time in 2 years, the resources and the clear direction she needed to do it properly. The conversation was the kind that happened when people who were genuinely interested in consequential things were seated next to other people who were genuinely interested in the same things, which required thought to arrange but looked, once arranged, entirely natural. Lord Pemberton told the Duke, on the way out, that the household seemed to be in very good order. The Duke said that it was. He said it with a tone she noticed from across the entrance hall, not the polite agreement of a man accepting a social compliment, the flat factual agreement of someone stating something they believed to be true. Charles Whitmore appeared at the 4th event of the season. This was unexpected. Not because he had no reason to be at a musical evening in a house that invited half of London society on a semi-regular basis, but because Eleanor had, in the weeks of the season, successfully managed to not be in the same room as him, which required some navigation given the relative smallness of the world they were now both moving in. She saw him from across the room before he saw her. He was with Cecily, his wife, a woman Eleanor had never met, who had dark hair and a composed, pleasant face, and was wearing something pale that was clearly expensive. They were standing with a group near the far windows, and Charles was doing the thing he had always done in social rooms, which was moving through them as though they had been arranged for his convenience. Eleanor continued her conversation with the woman she had been speaking to, a perfectly pleasant woman named Mrs. Carver who was telling her something about a concert she had attended in Bath, and did not look in Charles's direction again. She was aware, with the peripheral precision she had developed, of the moment he saw her. He stilled, just for a second, then he continued as he had been, but differently, with the slightly heightened awareness of a person who has just become conscious of something they had not expected to have to be conscious of. She let the music evening proceed. She spoke to several people and was genuinely interested in several of those conversations, and convincingly interested in the rest. She was introduced to Cecily Whitmore, by a third party, near the end of the evening, in circumstances that made avoiding the introduction impossible, and would have made attempting to avoid it obvious. Cecily Whitmore was perfectly pleasant. She was also, Eleanor thought, more perceptive than she had been given credit for in the social conversations Eleanor had overheard about the Whitmore marriage. She shook Eleanor's hand with the careful politeness of a woman who knows a situation is complicated and has decided to navigate it with maximum correctness. Eleanor shook her hand with exactly the same energy. They exchanged 3 or 4 sentences and then parted, and Eleanor resumed her conversation with the woman beside her, and Charles Whitmore stood 15 feet away and did not, for the remainder of the evening, say a single word to her. She noticed this. She had not expected him to, but she noticed. The Duke found her near the door at the end of the evening and they left without any discussion of what had just transpired, because there was nothing to discuss. But in the carriage on the way home he said, without looking at her, that the Whitmore man had been watching her for most of the second half of the evening. Eleanor said she had not noticed. He said, in exactly the same tone, that he thought she probably had. She looked out the window and said nothing. After a moment he said, also looking out the window, that the political situation with Lord Pemberton's faction was developing in a direction he thought worth discussing tomorrow. She said she would have her notes ready. He said he expected she would. The carriage moved through the London dark and Eleanor looked at the lights of the city going past and thought about a conversation that had not happened this evening and would not happen, and thought about a parlor in Wiltshire where a different conversation had happened 3.5 years ago, and noticed, with something that was partly relief and partly something she was not yet ready to name, that the Wiltshire parlor felt a very long way away. There was one more evening that season that mattered more than the others. It came 6 weeks into the season, after Eleanor had learned the rooms and the names and the particular social textures of a world she had not grown up in. After she had made the careful, deliberate adjustments that had moved her from uncertain newcomer to someone who was, if not entirely established, at least no longer being watched for signs of failure. It came at the Forsyth Ball. The Forsyth Ball was, as Mrs. Alderton had explained during one of their increasingly useful morning consultations, the event against which the season was measured. The guest list was exclusive in the way that exclusivity is most effective, which is to say that being on it was significant enough that being left off it was notable. The Duke's family had attended for 3 generations. His attendance this year, with Eleanor beside him, was the clearest possible statement of return. He was back. He had a wife. The household was functioning. The political concerns of the previous 2 years had been addressed. Eleanor understood what this evening needed to be before she arrived at it. She wore a gown that Mrs. Alderton had procured for this specific occasion, ivory silk with a small, intricate border along the hem, and she wore her mother's remaining earrings, the small pearls, which were the right thing in a room where the wrong kind of extravagance would have been noticed and assessed and found wanting. They arrived at the Forsyth house at 10, which was the correct time, and they were announced in the doorway as the Duke and Duchess of Hartwell, and Eleanor walked into the room beside the Duke and thought about nothing except what was directly in front of her, which was 300 people, and the beginning of something she intended to manage well. She managed it well. This is harder to describe than it was to do, because the things she did over the following 3 hours were individually small and collectively decisive. She had a conversation with the Forsyths' eldest daughter that lasted 9 minutes, and covered 4 topics, including one that the daughter had clearly not been expecting to be able to talk about seriously with anyone at this particular event. She spoke with the man the Duke needed to speak with about the Lord's situation and said exactly one thing during that conversation, which was the right thing, in the right moment, and which shifted the dynamic of the conversation in the direction the Duke had been trying to shift it for 6 weeks, through direct engagement, and had not managed. She did not draw attention to having done this. When the conversation ended and the man moved away and the Duke looked at her, she simply moved on to the next thing. Later, considerably later, the Duke found her near the entrance to the second drawing room and said, in a low voice, that what she had just done with Alcott had taken the situation from difficult to manageable in about 90 seconds. She said she had simply asked a question. He said the question had been precisely correct. She said she supposed she had gotten lucky then. He said that was not what had happened, and they both knew it. They stood together for a moment in the wide doorway, and the light from the room caught his face from the side, and she thought, with the part of her mind that observed things without her permission, that he was quite remarkable looking when he was not being deliberately expressionless. Then she thought about the arrangement. Then she excused herself to speak with Lady Forsyth about something she had been waiting to speak with Lady Forsyth about, and the remainder of the evening proceeded without incident of any kind. Charles Whitmore was not at the Forsyth ball. She noticed this too, which told her something she would have preferred not to know about the state of her own attention. The season ended in July, and they went to Wychwood. Eleanor had heard the name mentioned several times in conversation over the preceding months, always with a tone she had learned to recognize as the particular reverence reserved for places that carry a great deal of history. Wychwood, the Hartwell country estate. Wychwood, where the Duke had grown up. Wychwood, which had been, for the 2 years before Eleanor's arrival in his life, largely closed to visitors. She had not asked about it. He had not offered to describe it. The coach journey from London took the better part of a day. Eleanor watched the countryside change through the window as it always changed when you moved from London toward the western counties, the air gradually losing its edge, and the fields gradually widening, and the whole compressed pressure of the city releasing itself like a long-held breath. She had been in London for 8 months. She had not been away from it once. She had not, until this moment in the carriage, entirely registered how much of herself had been in a state of sustained performance, not dishonest performance, not false, but the continuous, tiring work of being observed. The carriage turned off the main road onto a smaller one, through a stretch of old oak trees that thickened on both sides until the light came through in broken pieces, and then the trees fell back and Wychwood appeared. Eleanor looked at it. It was large, considerably larger than she had pictured, built of the dark local stone that had gone nearly black in places with age and weathering, not beautiful in the conventional sense, not the sort of place someone would paint and sell copies of in shop windows, something older than beautiful. 400 years old in the oldest parts, she would later learn, with additions and alterations layered over the centuries in a way that should have produced chaos, and instead produced a particular kind of settled integrity, a building that knew what it was. She looked at it for a long time through the carriage window. The Duke was watching her. She asked what he was looking at. He said he was watching to see what she thought of it. She said it was extraordinary. He said nothing, but she had the impression that this was the answer he had wanted. The staff at Wychwood received them with the same formal efficiency as the London household, with the additional quality that came from people who had known this place and this family for a long time, and whose investment in it was therefore of a different character. The housekeeper, Mrs. Garland, had been at Wychwood for 30 years. She greeted Eleanor with a correctness that was almost entirely opaque, which Eleanor recognized as the highest form of professional reserve, not hostility, but the refusal to commit to any judgment before sufficient information had been gathered. Eleanor respected this. She had operated on the same principle for most of her adult life. She settled into Wychwood with the same methodical attention she had brought to Hartwell House in London, learning its rooms and its staff and its routines. But the learning felt different here. Hartwell House in London had been a place she was managing. Wychwood felt, from the first morning, more like a place she was inhabiting. The distinction was subtle, but real. She woke to the sound of birds rather than street noise. She took her breakfast looking out at a kitchen garden that needed attention but was full of the evidence of having once been exceptional. She walked the grounds in the afternoons and found herself genuinely interested in them, not as a property to be maintained but as a place she was learning the way you learn a person. The Duke walked with her, sometimes, not always. He had work that followed him from London, correspondence and papers that arrived by post 3 times a week, and he spent long mornings in his study at the east end of the house where the light was best. But in the afternoons, perhaps 4 days out of 7, he appeared at the edge of the kitchen garden or the beginning of the south path, and fell into step beside her, without saying anything about it, as though this were a thing they had simply always done. She let it become a thing they simply did. On the 3rd week, walking along the top of the ridge that looked south over the valley, he told her about his first wife. He did not do it with any announcement or preparation. They were walking, and then he was talking, in the measured, precise way he talked about everything. About a woman named Catherine who had been, he said, a genuinely good person, someone he had respected and been fond of in the way that you can be fond of someone without any of the complication of passion, who had died of a fever in the February of 2 years ago after a short illness that had been misunderstood by the physicians as something less serious than it was, until it was too late to correctly understand it as what it was. He spoke about this for perhaps 5 minutes. He did not ask for a response. She did not offer the consoling sort, because she had the impression that comfort was not what he was asking for, or what would be useful to him. She simply listened, in the way she had learned to listen that summer at Ashfield when the problems were large enough that there was nothing useful to say about them, only the usefulness of being present while they were being said. When he stopped speaking, they walked in silence for a while. Then she said she had not known about the illness. She said she was sorry it had happened that way, quickly and without the chance to prepare. He said yes. They turned at the top of the ridge and walked back toward the house. That evening at dinner he asked her about Ashfield, not about the debt or the financial situation, which they had never discussed directly since the solicitor's office, but about the place itself, what it was like, what she had done there. She told him, and found, as she told it, that there was more affection in the telling than she had expected. Ashfield had been a problem she had spent 3 years managing. It had also been her home, the place where her mother had lived and died, and where her father walked the east field in the mornings and where the kitchen had always smelled of wood smoke and the old cook's particular approach to bread. He listened the way she had listened, completely, without interruption. She stopped talking and looked at her glass. He said it sounded like a place that had been worth the effort. She said she thought so. The weeks at Wychwood were a different kind of time from anything she had experienced in London. In London she had been learning and working and performing and navigating. Here she was doing some of those things, but also, and this was the part that surprised her, simply living, walking in the grounds, reading in the library, which was large and well-stocked and had a window seat that caught the afternoon light in a way she had adopted as her own within the first week, talking to the Duke in the evenings about whatever came up, which turned out to be a great variety of things, because he was, she had by now entirely confirmed, considerably more interesting than his controlled public manner suggested. He had read widely and thought carefully about what he had read. He had views that were genuinely his own and had clearly been arrived at through a process of actual consideration rather than inherited position. When he disagreed with her, which happened regularly, he disagreed with arguments rather than with dismissal. She had not been disagreed with seriously by anyone in a very long time. She found she liked it considerably. She also found, which was more complicated, that she liked him. Not in a way she was prepared to examine directly. She had been careful about this since the solicitor's office. She had the arrangement clearly in her mind, what it was and what it was not, what had been offered and what had not. She had made an agreement and she intended to honor it without adding complications to it that had not been negotiated. But she liked him. This was a fact, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge facts. A letter arrived in the 5th week. It was from Charles. She knew the handwriting from 3.5 years ago, when they had exchanged correspondence regularly, letters that she had at the time kept in a box and had, in the January after the announcement of his marriage, burned in the fireplace along with the note about the wedding. She did not open this one. She held it for perhaps 30 seconds, standing in the hallway of Witchwood where Mrs. Garland had brought it to her, and then she walked to the library and put it, still sealed, in the fireplace. She added a log and watched until the paper was gone completely. She did not tell the Duke about the letter. She did not tell him because it was not relevant to their arrangement, and because she was entirely certain that what she had done with it was the correct thing to do, and she did not need to explain the correct thing to anyone. But she thought about it, afterward, not about Charles. She had not been thinking about Charles in any serious way for several weeks, and the letter had not changed this. She thought about the fact that the letter had arrived and she had burned it without hesitation, and felt nothing complicated about having done so, which told her something about the state of whatever she had once felt. 3.5 years ago, in a Wiltshire parlor, she had been told by a man she had been attached to that he had decided his life was going in a different direction. She had been quiet for a moment and said she understood, and then she had been very quiet about it, privately, for a long time afterward. She was no longer very quiet about it. She was, in fact, not quiet about it at all, which was to say it was not currently occupying any portion of her available thinking. She added another log to the library fire and went back to the book she had been reading. The Duke came into the library that evening as he sometimes did, not as a regular habit but not infrequently. He found her by the window with her book, with the fire burning well behind her. He poured himself something from the decanter on the side table and sat down in the other chair, and they were quiet together for a while, which was one of the specific things she had noticed about being with him. The silence was comfortable. She had not had a great many silences in her life that were comfortable. He said after a while, looking at the fire, that he had been thinking about the autumn schedule and a point she had made 2 weeks ago about the timing of his return to Parliament. She said she remembered the point. He said she had been right. She said she often was. He looked at her sideways, and she looked at him, and he made the sound he occasionally made, which was not quite a laugh but was in the general direction of one. She went back to her book. Outside, Witchwood sat in the late summer dark, its old stone cooling at the end of a long day, the grounds quiet, the valley below full of the sound of crickets. Eleanor turned a page and did not think about the arrangement, because just at this moment there was nothing about the arrangement that required thinking. She was, she noticed, at ease. This was not something she had been at ease about being, because she had not, for a very long time, been at ease at all. The morning after the library evening, Eleanor woke earlier than usual and walked out before the house was fully awake. The grounds of Witchwood in the early morning were different from the grounds at any other hour. The light came over the east ridge at an angle that made the grass look silver rather than green, and the mist that came up from the valley floor hung at the low points of the land in still, white pools. She walked along the south path and then up the ridge and stood at the top where the view opened out over the valley, the same view that was in the painting in the London dining room, and looked at it for a long time without thinking about anything in particular. She had been slowly and carefully admitting to herself over the past several weeks, content. This was a word she had not associated with herself in some time. She had been capable, often. She had been purposeful and focused and effective and occasionally proud of specific things she had managed to accomplish in difficult circumstances. But content was a different thing. Content was what you were when the background worry had gone quiet enough that you could feel the absence of it. The background worry had, she realized, gone quiet. Not entirely. She was too thorough a person to let anything go entirely unexamined. There were still things to manage and think about and work toward. The political situation the Duke was navigating would require careful attention into the autumn. The household in London was running well but needed continued oversight. She had a dozen small responsibilities that were hers and that she took seriously. But underneath all of that, which had once been the surface of a sea over something dark and uncertain, there was now something else, something that felt like ground. She walked back down the ridge and came around the long way, past the kitchen garden, which she had been slowly and with Mrs. Garland's increasingly willing assistance bringing back into something like its former usefulness. 3 of the beds had been replanted. There was already evidence of success in 2 of them. The Duke was at the edge of the kitchen garden when she came around the corner of the east wall. He was in his riding clothes, which meant he had been out early too, and was standing looking at the beds with an expression she could not immediately read. She said good morning. He said good morning. He said the garden looked considerably better than it had. She said she thought so too. He looked at her for a moment. She had become, over the months of their strange and unprecedented domestic arrangement, reasonably fluent in his silences. There were several kinds. There was the working silence when he was thinking through a problem. There was the comfortable silence, which she had first encountered in the library. There was a rarer silence, which she had only noticed in the past few weeks, that came at moments she could not entirely predict and which had, she thought, a quality of consideration to it, the sense of a man deciding something. This was that silence. She waited. He said, looking back at the garden rather than at her, that he had been thinking about an arrangement. She said, carefully, that they already had one. He said he meant a different arrangement. He said he meant the question of whether what they currently had between them was in fact what she wanted, and if not, what she would prefer instead. She was quiet for a moment. She said she was not sure what the options were. He said, still looking at the garden, that the current arrangement was one option. It was functioning well. He thought she was happy enough in it, or something close to happy. He did not think it was making her unhappy, in any case. He did not think he was making her unhappy. She said he was not. He said there was another arrangement, which was one in which the original terms were allowed to evolve, as both of them had changed since the solicitor's office, and in which what they had been building over the past several months was acknowledged to be what it actually was, rather than what it had been agreed to be at the start. She said she was not entirely sure what he meant. He turned to look at her. He said he was asking whether she would consider remaining his wife, not because the arrangement required it, but because she chose to. She looked at him. He said it poorly, he thought. He said he had not practiced it, which was possibly an error. He said he was asking if she would remain with him because she wanted to, because he thought she might, and because he knew he did, and because these were two things that seemed worth saying out loud. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. The morning light was coming over the east wall of the kitchen garden, the same light she had watched from the ridge, and it caught the side of his face and made him look, she thought, considerably less like the deliberate, controlled man she had met in the solicitor's office than he did at any other hour. She said she was already staying, that she had been staying, that this had been, she thought, obvious. He said he had hoped so, but he had wanted to be certain. She said, in the mild tone she used for things that were actually quite significant, that she supposed certainty was reasonable. He said yes. They stood at the edge of the kitchen garden for another moment. Then he said he was going to be late for the steward's meeting if he did not leave in the next 5 minutes, and she said she supposed he had better go, and he went. And Eleanor stood for a moment in the kitchen garden and breathed the morning air, and looked at the beds she had replanted and thought, with something approaching wonder, about how completely the shape of a life could change in a year. Not the surface of it, the actual shape. She had come into this arrangement with nothing to offer but competence and clarity of purpose and the particular stubbornness of someone who is not prepared to be finished. She had not come into it expecting to find anything for herself beyond the solution to a specific and devastating problem. She had found something else entirely, not despite the arrangement, through it. She went inside to have her breakfast and begin the day. That afternoon she wrote a long letter to her father at Ashfield, telling him about the kitchen garden and the view from the ridge and a book she had found in the Witchwood library that she thought he would enjoy. She told him the house was extraordinary and that she was well. She said she hoped the East Field was recovering from the wet season. She did not tell him about the morning conversation in the kitchen garden. Some things were not for letters. She sealed the letter and gave it to Mrs. Garland to send, and then went back to her book, and the afternoon light moved across the library floor in the slow and particular way of autumn light in that room. And outside, Witchwood sat in the late-season quiet, and Eleanor Cavendish read her book and was entirely, genuinely, and without reservation, present in the life she was living. The second London season began in February. Eleanor Cavendish arrived into it differently than she had arrived into the first, which was to say without the sustained, braced quality of a person who knows they are moving into difficult ground and has prepared every available defense. She had done all of that preparation during the first season, and she had learned what was needed and had become reasonably fluent in it, and now she simply arrived, as herself, to continue the work. Hartwell House had settled in the months she had been away, or rather, it had been settled for some time, and she could feel the difference when she walked back into it. The quality of a household that knows its direction and trusts the people giving it. Mrs. Alderton had things in hand as completely as they had been left. The rooms were ready. The staff had, it seemed, come to some collective decision about Eleanor in her absence, and the decision was broadly positive. She went through the house on her first morning back and noted what needed attention, and spoke to Mrs. Alderton about the season's calendar, and the conversation had the ease of two people who have established how they work together, and do not need to re-establish it from scratch every time. The Duke was in London 2 days after she arrived. He came back from a meeting at Westminster looking slightly less than his usually controlled self, which she had learned to read as the sign of something having gone unexpectedly well, because he controlled his expression most rigorously when the news was good. She asked how it had gone. He said better than expected. She said she was glad. He said the specific point she had identified 3 months ago about the procedural argument had turned out to be the right point to press on, and that it had been pressed on successfully, and that the coalition against his vote was in considerably weaker position than it had been at the start of the month. She said she supposed she should trust her own analysis more often. He said she should, and that he intended to tell her so regularly to compensate for the years during which no one had. She looked at him. He said it in the same tone he used for everything factual. She said that was kind. He said it was not kindness. She went back to the correspondence she had been working through, but she was aware for the rest of that afternoon of a particular quality to the afternoon, a kind of clarity and warmth that had nothing to do with the February weather, which was gray and cold and entirely unpromising. The second season was, socially speaking, a different campaign from the first. In the first season she had been establishing herself, working against the disadvantage of novelty, demonstrating that she was competent and serious and not going to embarrass anyone. By the beginning of the second season this had been accomplished, and the work now was different. It was the work of someone with a position rather than someone trying to establish one. The distinction was significant. She found, once she was inside the difference, that she was better suited to this version of the work than she had been to the previous one. She had always been more comfortable as someone with a purpose than as someone with a project. The first season had been a project. The second season was a purpose. The Pemberton ball came in the third week of March. Eleanor arrived knowing she would see Charles Whitmore there. She had seen him twice during the first season and had managed both encounters with a competence she was satisfied with, which was to say she had been civil and unaffected, and had left each encounter feeling no particular way about it. She expected the third encounter to proceed the same way. It did not. Charles found her near the east drawing room at some point in the middle of the evening, when the rooms were full and the music was playing and the particular social density of the Pemberton ball was at its peak. She had been talking to Lord Forsyth about something he was interested in, and had excused herself to find a glass of water, and Charles was simply there, at the point between one room and the next, in a way that she suspected was not entirely accidental. He looked the same as he always had, which she noted without feeling anything particular about it. He said it was good to see her. She said it was good to see him also. He said she seemed very well. She said she was, thank you. There was a moment. She had been in enough social situations in the past year to know a moment when she felt one, the fractional pause that says someone is about to say something they have been building toward. She let the pause complete itself and waited. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings, about things from before, about how things had gone between them. He said he realized it had been a difficult situation, and he wanted her to know that he had thought about it. Eleanor looked at him. She thought, with the brief, clear detachment that good surprise sometimes produces, that she had imagined this moment. Not frequently, not obsessively, but she had imagined it, in the early months after the Gazette notice and the beginning of the London season, when she was still calibrating the strangeness of her new position. She had imagined what it would feel like. She had imagined being angry, or sad, or devastatingly composed in a way that communicated everything without saying anything. She was none of these things. She was simply standing in the doorway of the Pemberton ball's east drawing room, holding a glass of water, looking at a man she had once expected to marry, and feeling, with complete and genuine clarity, almost nothing at all. Not the nothing of suppression, the nothing of actual absence. The space where the feeling had been filled, over the course of a year, with other things, and the filling had been so thorough that there was genuinely nothing left. She said she appreciated him saying so. She said there were no hard feelings. She said it in the tone she used for simple facts, because it was a simple fact. He looked at her for a moment. He said she seemed very settled, very much in her element. She said she supposed she was. He said, carefully, that Hartwell clearly suited her. She looked at him. She said Witchwood particularly was extraordinary, and that she had been improving the kitchen garden. He blinked. She said she hoped he and his wife were well, and that it had been very nice to see him, and then she walked past him into the room she had been heading for, and did not look back. and did not think about the conversation again for the rest of the evening. She thought about it slightly, later, in the carriage. Not about Charles, about the nothing, the genuine absence of the feeling she had expected to have in that moment, about how much work it had taken, in the years when the feeling had been present, to manage and contain and move through it without letting it show, about the fact that the work of the past year, which had been considerable, had produced an outcome that included the disappearance of a pain she had been carrying for 3 years, so gradually that she had not noticed it leaving. She thought about what had replaced it. The Duke was beside her in the carriage, looking out his window at the London streets. He had had a productive evening. Lord Ashby had committed in writing to a position the Duke had needed him to hold, and 2 other men of significance had made statements in his direction that amounted to a realignment of the political landscape he had been navigating for 2 years. He said, without looking away from the window, that she had handled the Whitmore encounter well. She said she had not handled it particularly. She had simply had it. He said there was a distinction there, but he was not going to argue with her. She said that was unusual. He said he was tired and saving his arguments for the morning. She looked out her own window. The city moved past, the same city it had always been, indifferent to individual lives in the way that only very large things can afford to be indifferent. It had not cared, when she arrived, whether she managed or failed. It had simply continued moving. She had managed. She had managed considerably better than managing, which was the part she had not expected. She said, to the window rather than to the Duke, that she wanted to go back to Witchwood. He said they would, at the end of the season. She said she meant sooner. She said she thought the season's main purposes had been accomplished, and that Witchwood in the spring, before everything became green, was a particular thing she had not yet seen and wanted to. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said they could leave at the end of the week, if she was certain the main purposes had been accomplished. She said she was entirely certain. He said he supposed she would know. She said she would. The carriage continued through London, and Eleanor watched the city go past and thought about Witchwood in the early spring, the ridge with the view of the valley, the kitchen garden coming back to itself, the library in the morning when the light was at its particular best. She thought about the library in the morning, and the Duke in his chair with a book and the comfortable silence that they had, somehow, built between them in the space of a year, out of a transaction in a solicitor's office, and an honest accounting of need, and a handshake between 2 people who were both, in different ways, choosing the only available path forward. She had not chosen him, exactly. She had chosen the circumstances that led to him, but she had chosen to stay. Once staying became a choice rather than a necessity, and that was the choice that mattered. She had chosen Witchwood. She had chosen the person he was in the kitchen garden and the library and the evening conversations that had long since stopped being about anything particular and had simply become the way they talked to each other. She had chosen the man who told her, in the plain and undecorated way he said everything that was actually true, that she was worth telling. She had chosen this, the whole remarkable, improbable, entirely unplanned shape of it. The carriage stopped at Hartwell House. The footman opened the door. Eleanor stepped down into the cold February night and looked up at the lit windows of the house that she was now, in every way that counted, the mistress of. She went inside. At the end of the week they took the coach to Witchwood. The journey was long, and they spent the first hour working through correspondence, and the second hour reading, and the third, when the roads became quieter and the countryside came back, and the light changed, the way it always changed heading west, simply being in the coach together, with no particular agenda. She fell asleep at some point in the afternoon, which she rarely did in carriages, and woke when the wheels changed sound on the Witchwood Drive, the particular crunch of the gravel that was different from any other road she knew. She sat up. The Duke was looking at her. He had the expression he wore in the kitchen garden in the mornings, the one she had learned to read as the one underneath the controlled one. He said they had arrived. She looked out the window at Witchwood coming into view, the old dark stone, the tall windows catching the last of the afternoon light, the grounds with their early spring pallor that was, just barely, beginning to show the first green. She said yes. They had. The house opened to receive them. Mrs. Garland at the door with her contained professional welcome, the smell of beeswax and old wood and the particular Witchwood smell she had not known she had memorized until the moment she walked back into it and knew it completely. Eleanor Cavendish walked into Witchwood, and the house settled around her the way it had been settling around her for the better part of a year, the way a house does when someone has stopped moving through it carefully and has simply started living in it. Charles Whitmore was back in London, in his comfortable townhouse, going about his entirely adequate life. She did not think about this. She did not think about Charles Whitmore at all. She thought about whether the kitchen garden beds she had planted in the autumn had survived the winter, and whether Mrs. Garland had arranged for the library fire to be lit, and about a particular conversation she had been meaning to have with the Duke about a section of the Southland that she thought was being underused. She had things to do. She had people to talk to. She had a home that was genuinely and completely hers, built out of the ruins of a catastrophe she had not chosen, and the extraordinary accident of a man she had not expected. She had herself, which was the part she had always had, and the part that had made all of it possible. This was enough. This was, in fact, considerably more than enough. This was a life. She found Mrs. Garland in the kitchen and asked about the beds. Mrs. Garland, who had in the months of Eleanor's tenancy at Witchwood moved from professional reserve to something that was still professional but considerably warmer in its underlying quality, told her that 2 of the 3 beds had survived well and 1 had been partially damaged by the late frost in January, but was showing recovery. She told her this with the directness of someone reporting to a person who wants accurate information rather than reassuring information, which was the change Eleanor had noticed most clearly in their working relationship. In the first weeks, Mrs. Garland had given her the careful, slightly softened reports of a person not yet sure how much honesty was welcome. Now she simply said what was true. Eleanor thanked her and said she would look at the frost-damaged bed in the morning. She went to the library. The fire had been lit. The room was warm and smelled correctly of itself, and the window seat she had claimed in the first week of the previous summer's stay was empty and waiting. She sat in it and looked out at the grounds in the last of the afternoon light, the lawn going gray-green in the dusk, the old oak at the edge of the south path already showing the faintest possible beginning of its spring leaves. The Duke came in after a while. He had changed out of his traveling clothes and had a sheaf of papers he set on the table by the fire, which meant he intended to work, which was fine. They had long since established that being in the same room and doing different things was a perfectly comfortable arrangement, which was, when she thought about it, a significant achievement for 2 people who had met in a solicitor's office 14 months ago. He sat down. He looked at his papers. He looked up at her. He said she looked pleased. She said she was. He said Witchwood agreed with her. She said she thought so. He said, looking back at his papers, that he had been thinking about the Southland. She said she had been thinking about it too. He said he would like to discuss it tomorrow. She said she had suggestions. He said he was certain she did. She looked back out the window. The dusk was deepening now, the grounds going darker, the sky in the west still holding a thin line of pale yellow above the ridge. The valley below was already in shadow. She thought, briefly and without any particular weight, about the Eleanor Ashford who had sat in the kitchen at Ashfield 11 months ago with her father's terrible envelope and a complete absence of good options. She thought about the coach to London and the waiting room, and the painting of the inoffensive landscape. She thought about a handshake. She thought about all of the things that had happened between that handshake and this room, this fire, this evening, this particular quality of ease that she had thought, for most of her adult life, was not something she was going to be able to have. She had built it, out of a transaction and a disaster and a man who said things directly, and a house that had been waiting for someone to fill it up again properly. She had built it with the same methodical, unglamorous, entirely effective stubbornness she had brought to everything she had ever needed to do. And here it was. She said, without looking away from the window, that she thought they should open the north rooms this spring, the ones that had been closed since the previous family, back in the 1820s, who had apparently used them as nursery rooms and then at some point simply shut them, and left them shut for 30 years before the current family acquired them. The Duke said he had not thought about the north rooms in some time. She said she had been thinking about them since October. She said the light in that wing in the spring mornings was probably remarkable, given the orientation, and that rooms did not improve with shutting. He looked at her. She said, still looking out the window, that it was something to consider. He said it was. He said he thought she was probably right. She said she was often right. He said she was, and that he had told her he would continue to say so regularly. She turned from the window and looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression that had stopped being any kind of surprise to her some months ago, the expression that lived underneath the controlled one, and that she had come, without deciding to trust as the truest thing about him. She said she supposed she was glad she had come to London that day. He said he was glad she had come too. She said the waiting room had a terrible painting. He said yes, he had always thought so. She said she had rather liked it, in fact, because of how thoroughly it had committed to being inoffensive. He looked at her for a moment, and then he did the thing that had taken months to appear and that she had found herself looking forward to, which was that the controlled expression gave way entirely to something genuine and amused, and he laughed. A short laugh, a real one. She smiled. She looked back out the window. Outside, Witchwood was fully dark now. The ground settled into the particular darkness of countryside that is full of living things going quietly about the business of being alive in the dark. The ridge was invisible, but she knew where it was. She knew where every part of it was. She had learned this place the way she had learned everything that had ever mattered to her, thoroughly and without rushing, paying complete attention. She was paying complete attention now. She was in a library in a house that was hers, with a fire and a window seat and the remains of the day's light fading over a valley she could see from the ridge, and a kitchen garden she had replanted herself, and a man whose laughter she had come to value more than she had expected to value almost anything. She had built this out of 4,200 pounds of debt and 60 days and a solicitor's office, and her own unassailable refusal to be finished before she was finished. She looked out at the dark Witchwood grounds and felt, with a completeness she had not known she was capable of, that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because anything had predestined it, nothing had. The whole thing was an accident and a transaction, and a series of choices made under pressure. But she had made the choices. She had kept making them, one after another, all the way here, to this room, this fire, this evening. And here was enough. Here was everything.